donde yo soy profesor universitario, tuve un estudiante de esa primera migración. Con sus padres, se casó allá en Venezuela y antes de ir a Colombia.
Hi, how are you? Good, how you doing, John? Good, thanks.
Fue esa primera migración de gente que tenía dinero y que sabía. Sí, esa primera migración. Y se dieron.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, pleasure.
Hola, John. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo andas, joven? Cuéntame de su vida. Todo muy bien. Me alegro mucho.
So we had seven people registered on our site.
Yeah.
Like, wait.
Okay, yeah, no, John was saying we'll probably start around 40 or.
Okay.
Y ha habido apoyo, se les da seguridad social, educación, salud, sí, pues integrándolos al sistema.
Pero si hay una xenofobia.
Sí, la xenofobia es
Sí,
brutal.
tremendo.
Y es muy difícil de entender porque somos la mitad de una
Somos
persona.
hermanos.
Sí, Venezuela, Colombia.
Y además los colombianos, la diáspora colombiana.
¿Había millones en Venezuela?
Claro.
Sí, un millón.
Venezolanos, empezando por eso. Sí, es que es ridículo. Sí.
Que al caído caer.
Sí, y es
¿Sabes qué te
triste.
he dicho?
¿Cómo?
Al caído caer.
No.
You attack the weak.
Ah.
¿Y de quién estamos hablando? ¿Quién es el protagonista de este
De
abuso?
Colombia, Venezuela.
Oh,
Colombia.
sorry. I'm gonna bow out here, man. I know when not to, I know when the water gets deep.
Está bien, está bien, sí.
You know what I mean? All the things have changed, right? Yes.
Well, the direction, that's what.
The direction, yeah.
I mean, there's millions of Colombians.
Right.
You know Alejandro Velasquez.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
his family's like originally from Colombia, but they all went to Venezuela.
I actually did not realize that.
I found that out because I have an ex-colleague, she's at Records now, but she was talking to Alejandro when he came years ago and gave a talk.
Right.
And he was just sort of saying, yeah, I'm Colombian. And they just
I did
chatted.
not realize that at all.
Yeah, yeah.
That, I love that book. I think it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, many times.
He came to speak, when I was starting off at John Jay, I organized the lecture for him. And yeah, it's fine. I was, you know, young, energetic, dynamic, assistant professor wanted to show, and then I show up with his book for my students, and my students are like, my man, what is happening here? Like, what is he talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Because there was no, you know, like you can talk to people about, you know, Fidel
I mean, the
So-
more and more I get older, I kind of wish I had
No,
more.
yeah.
I wish I had my
Me too.
younger me.
Well, I
Like,
joke,
why?
my wife and I joke that we're both Cuban and we're always like the whole Cuban entrepreneurial money making thing kind of skipped us. Like, it's like, I don't know what happened,
Yeah.
but it just did not like,
Yeah.
it didn't resonate with us, but apparently it has with him. So,
Yeah.
so, more power to him. I don't know.
Yeah, no, my wife and I, neither of us got it, although both of our sisters are like ridiculously rich. So
Right.
if I ever got into government office, I would like expropriate them.
That's very funny. You'd be like Phoenix, right? One of
I
those
get
first
that
places that he expropriates is his father's farm,
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah, my parents not so much though.
yeah.
I mean, they like didn't quite get the memo.
Well, we were in Spain last summer with the boys because we're getting to that point. My older one is a junior in college, the younger one's a junior in high school, and life is gonna come at us very quickly, right?
Totally.
And he said, and so part of my mother's family is from northern Spain. They did very well for themselves.
Yeah.
And there's this gigantic house that was built by one of my great grandfather's sisters. And my oldest one looked at me and he goes, "Why the hell is money there?" I was like, it did not make its way across the Atlantic. Somebody kept it here. It did not come to Newark, New Jersey. So anyway, we should probably get started. Yes? Okay. Fantastic.
Perfect.
By the way, once I'm done with the intro, I'm gonna sit over there just because I wanna be able to see your presentation. Good evening. Hello, hi, how are you? My name is John Gutierrez. I'm director here at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to the launch of this book, Gabriel Hetland's Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn, which is published by Columbia University Press. Gabriel is Associate Professor of Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the University at Albany at SUNY. In addition to this book, he's written and spoken widely about Venezuela and Bolivia in academic and popular venues. I won't go through all of them. All I will say to you is that somehow or another, he managed to get on Democracy Now! And Fox News. How he pulled that off, I have no idea, but it is really impressive. I don't want to take a lot from Gabriel's presentation today, but when he approached us earlier this year about hosting this event, part of the reason why we said yes is because the questions that he raises in the book about democracy, about the ways in which the left in Latin America can and has been able to shape the contours and playing field of democratic political spaces, were questions that we saw as having a certain urgency and practical importance for the current moment in Latin America. In other words, this book raises many questions that we all, as Latin Americanists and as those interested in Latin America, should be asking. So I keep my intro short because I'm not the star of the show. He is. So please join me in welcoming Gabriel Hetland.
Thank you so much. If I stand up, I can just hold the microphone. Does that work? Okay. I'm not used to sitting down, so I'll try sitting down, but then I'll see. So thank you, John and Fatima, so much for the privilege of speaking here. Thank you all for showing up. I know it's a somber time, and I appreciate the chance to talk to all of you today. I wasn't planning on getting into it, and I won't, but if anyone is interested in Q&A, I'm happy to talk about the Fox News. I can just say it was shockingly on brand. I mean, the most manipulative interview experience, kind of a fascinating story. So I'll leave that for later if anybody wants to hear, like blows your mind by how stereotypical it was. And they call me a Latin American affairs expert, which I kind of like. All right, so I'll just jump right in. And this is the first official book talk I did. I did another sort of version of this at American Sociology Association in August, when every other panelist on my panel, for reasons unrelated to me as far as I know, dropped out. So I was the only person. And so I was like, all right, well, this will be my first book talk. So this is sort of the second one, but Based on that, I'm sort of in the middle of reorganizing it. So you guys will be the guinea pigs to tell me if I need to keep doing that. Between 2005 and 2016, Torres, a municipality in the central western Venezuelan state of Laura, may have been the most democratic city in the world. During this time, ordinary citizens exercised a remarkable degree of popular control over local political decision-making. This occurred in several ways, the most important being Torres's participatory budget, which gave citizens binding control over 100% of municipal investment funds. Here's some pictures of Torres's participatory budget. Let's see, I'll figure out how this works. From 2008 and 2009, during my initial research there, this one shows a participatory diagnosis where residents map out their resources and needs. Here's another one of that. And these are a few different pictures of parish assemblies where voceros, which are spokespeople, get together from the 17 parishes within Torres, and they discuss all sorts of priorities, and then they have votes on how those priorities go. So you can see different assemblies happening throughout a vast municipality. I mean, it's huge geographically speaking. This is the mayor, Edgar Carrasco. I'll talk more about his predecessor in a few minutes. Here's some of the budget amounts that people were talking about. Here's some of the voting that was happening. And then here's one of the inspections that happened afterwards. So in the research that I did in Torres, which is part of a broader project that I talk about in the book, I found that decision-making in the participatory budget was highly deliberative, with agricultural laborers, students, domestic caregivers, teachers, small farmers, and others engaging in thoughtful discussions of the merits of spending limited budget money on this versus that project. The project was highly inclusive, with no formal or de facto restrictions in terms of class, race and ethnicity, gender, religion, or political views. Most participants came from the popular classes, but there were middle class and some elite participants. There were more women than men, more non-whites than whites. Chavistas predominated, but there were many non-Chavistas and some oppositionists. Thousands and probably tens of thousands of people comprising somewhere between 8 and 25% of the whole population of Torres, which is about 185,000, participated in the process each year. Decisions were effectively linked to outcomes. Upwards of 85% of projects were implemented in a timely manner, with citizens directly implementing more than 3/4 of these projects. And so Torres is, as I said, one of 4 cities that I studied for the book, Democracy on the Ground. And if you want to purchase a copy after the talk, I have a few here for sale. In each of the city, I researched whether participatory reforms succeeded or not by examining these 4 indicators. So the 4 indicators were the extent of popular control over decision-making, which I look at by looking at what % goes to participatory budgeting. Do they have popular control over non-budgetary issues and how much turnout there is? Quality of popular control, I look at factors such as how inclusive is a process. Do citizens actually have binding control over decisions, or can officials countermand decisions if they don't agree with them? How sort of politically inclusive it is. Institutional effectiveness basically looks at, if people decide on something, does it actually happen? So what % of the budget gets implemented? How successful is that? And then political effectiveness is looking at the local incumbent party. Are they succeeding based on this sort of participatory project? Is the mayor or is the local incumbent party getting reelected? Does that happen with new mayoral candidates? And then what are local civil society and local state civil society relations like? So in all 4 of the cities I attended, that I did research in, I attended over 150 local government, civic association, political party meetings, assemblies, workshops, protests, and other events. I conducted interviews with about 200 plus elected officials, bureaucrats, party civic association leaders and members, and citizens. And this took place over about 22 months of fieldwork between 2007 and 2016. So I went back and forth many, many times. Kind of exhausting. In the middle of it, got divorced. So it's not necessarily recommended. Happily remarried now, but this is a sort of effective way to see the differences between different cities, because it's strikingly obvious when you go from one country to another how the differences look. So it's really, really sort of interesting research methodology, I would say. So here's a summary of the findings that I have For Torres, and pardon the fact that I wrote lots and lots of words, so I'll go over this sort of slowly and hopefully make it make some sense. And actually here I will stand up because I can deviate a little bit from the script. So I can do this, which is more, I'll try to stay in the camera, I guess. So there was extensive popular control over decision-making. 100% of the investment budget goes to participatory budgeting. So there are other things that they do. They spend money on light bulbs, they spend money on people's salaries, but any new investment budget stuff goes through the participatory budget. There was this massive turnout, again, between 8 and 25% of the population. And there was also significant control over non-budgetary decisions. So Torres is filled with potholes at the time when I was there because citizens felt like other things were more important. So one of the guys that I stayed with during my research would swear all the time when he was driving through the city because he kept hitting potholes and banging his head and messing up his car. So I was at a meeting where the bus drivers were coming together and saying, we need to fix these potholes. So we're going to raise, our tarifas, we're going to raise our fares on the buses. And so all the citizens got together and said, well, we're a socialist municipality, we're a socialist country, you can't just do that, that's going to affect us. So they had a long, drawn-out discussion about it. And the facilitators at one point said, well, they could just say no to everything. So why don't you go with the proposal that the citizens came up with, which was for like a 25% instead of 100% fare raise. So there really was a lot of decision-making controlling things, not just the budget. And that was very impressive and somewhat unique to the case of Torres. There was very high quality control over the decisions. Citizens had binding control, and one of the sort of ways that you could tell this is the mayor, Julio Chavez, who was elected in 2005 and was key to sort of starting the participatory budget, would tell a story about when he was first elected his first year in office. 13% of the funds went for evangelical churches. He's a Marxist. He was not happy about this at all, but he loved recounting the story because he couldn't do anything about it. So when there's things that he didn't like, they stuck around. They really were, citizens actually had binding control over that. Decision-making was very deliberative. And so I went to many, many meetings to sort of participate and observe and see what was going on. And I could really see that people were giving reasons for what they were doing. They were talking about security at night. They were talking about women's safety issues. They were talking about electricity blackouts and, should we spend money on electricity? Should we spend money on drainage? Should we spend money on this or that? And there was just a lot of sort of back and forth. The binding control over decisions was interesting because every single city I went to, including Torres, there was lots of officials who would constantly try to intervene. And they'd constantly try to say, we think you should do this. We think that a sports field would be better than doing a cultural center, because if you have a sports field, you can have 200 or 300 people, whereas if you have a cultural center, you're only going to have 4 or 5 people. So that happened in Torres, but the citizens themselves were able to still decide on it. Sometimes they agreed with the officials, but they actually had binding decision-making control, which was not the case in some of the other cities that I studied. It was a politically and socially inclusive process. And the officials there were really, really rigorous about saying anyone can participate. It doesn't matter if you're red or blue. They sort of talked about their political colors. They were strict about sort of talking about religion as something that stays out of here. Politics in a broad sense did happen in meetings. People talked about socialism, they talked about values, they talked about revolution. But party politics was by and large absent from the actual discussion. People were really sort of clear, this is a civic space, this is a participatory space where we're going to decide as citizens. It was an institutionally effective process. So projects, to the best of sort of evidence that I could gather, were implemented in a relatively timely manner. Somewhere between 86 and 100% of the projects were actually implemented over about a 4-year period when I was tracking it. And again, citizens themselves through communal councils, so sort of local groups of citizens getting together, were putting together about 3/4 of those at the height. So they were doing most of the actual implementation. And it was politically effective. So the fellow that you saw a bit earlier, let me go back. Oops, sorry, I got this. Not him. So here's the mayor. This is Edgar Carrasco. He was the chief of staff of Julio Chavez, who was the first mayor. Julio Chavez is a very charismatic fellow. He can speak. He's a great orator. Edgar Carrasco is a bureaucrat, an effective administrator, not at all charismatic. as you can sort of see, maybe from the picture. He was reelected multiple times after Julio Chavez with rising turnout and a rising vote because of the success of this. So the fact that you have the same party with a new mayoral candidate who wasn't really a politician getting reelected speaks a lot to the success of the process. And then being a sort of pesky researcher and trying to be provocative at times, I would ask questions like, shouldn't you just leave the decisions to the mayor? And people told me really interesting things when I would say that. So one vocero in a participatory budget assembly said this: in the past, government officials would stay all day in their air-conditioned offices and make decisions there. They never even set foot in our community. So who do you think can make a better decision about what we need? An official in his air-conditioned office who has never even come to our community, or someone who is from the community? And other people told me as well about sort of how they didn't believe in the participatory budget, but then they saw the process working year after year. So another marker of the political effectiveness of it was that local state civil society relations were by and large cooperative. The process generated consent to a significant and even surprising degree at times, because the amount of money that they're talking about sometimes is fairly low. Many people came away from the meetings not getting what they wanted, and yet they felt happy about it because they were participating. So this is Julio Chavez, who's a more charismatic mayor, and he's a key to why this happened. And so if we're sort of thinking about Torres as a model of urban participation, local participatory success, it seems to fit what we would expect from existing literature about leftist political parties, about urban participation. Julio Chavez comes from a left movement party, a movement left party, or a social movement party, which is a left of center party that's pro-participation and is strongly linked to social movements. So you can see this is one of many, many times when he engaged in significant mobilization of his base, and there's lots of strong social movements within Torres. So if there's a formula for participatory success, Torres seems to sort of meet that formula. But when I scratched the surface of the case, it was actually more complicated, and there was more of a crooked line or crooked path to the participatory success. Julio Chavez, when he was elected in 2004, came from a non-sort of Chavista party. He wasn't from the ruling Fifth Republic movement, which Chavez was still a member of at the time. He had to run against that party in order to get elected in 2004. He managed to squeak through barely, beating an opposition candidate who was the previous mayor, who had been with the Fifth Republic movement and then left it because he was actually a conservative in disguise, and then a member of the Fifth Republic movement. So Julio Chavez squeaked in, but he had a majority in city council who was against him. Nonetheless, he identified very strongly with Chavismo. He had sort of campaign posters saying Julio Chavez es poder popular, so he used the language of Chavismo. When you asked him what he was up to, he said things like this: all expressions of socialism should be based on the people's participation, a participation that impedes bureaucratism. We say that the people should make all the decisions. We'd rather err with the people than be right without the people. So he sounded somewhat like Hugo Chavez. He talked about socialism, he talked about Bolivarianism. He considered himself a faithful Chavista, but he was running against Chavista political parties. He was coming up against massive opposition. National bureaucrats were trying to stop some of the things that he was doing. Regional leaders of the Fifth Republic movement, the ruling party of Chavez, were also opposed to him. And so I make sense of this by arguing that we have to think about these local cases in their relationship to the national context. And the national context, of course, was Hugo Chavez, who was elected in 1998, thrown out in a coup in 2002, comes back. And I characterize all the complexity of the Chavez years as a case of rising and then later on falling left populist hegemony, by which I mean that the Chavista government succeeded in generating significant consent. And I've left out slides that sort of show this, but if you look at the electoral returns of Chavez and the ruling Fifth Republic movement, and then the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, very impressive electoral returns year after year after year when Chavez was in power. The percentage of Venezuelans who felt like they were living in a democracy increased significantly under Chavez. And most significantly, which I'll talk about in a minute, the opposition started to change its tune and actually play a little bit more, play politics on Chavista terrain. So I argue that Chavez succeeded in creating a leftist form of hegemony, being a sort of moral and intellectual leadership that transformed politics such that all forces had to operate on it. And you can sort of see that even in the case of Torres, where a leftist party is operating on Chavista terrain, using the language of Chavismo, using Chavista sort of discourse, using institutional forms, using ideas of participation, ideas of socialism, trying to radicalize, trying to do more than the Chavista project. So if I had a longer time on just Chavismo, I talk about all the many contradictions it has, the way in which they try to control things at the local level, the profound corruption and clientelism, but they provided a sort of political base. We can see this even more strongly in the second case that I look at in the book, which is Sucre, Venezuela. This is one of the municipalities in the greater Caracas metropolitan region. And it was governed by Chavistas from 2000 to 2008. It flipped to the center-right opposition from 2009 to 2017, has a population of somewhere between 600,000 and 1.2 million, depending on official or unofficial estimates. And then the population is about 80% popular classes, 20% middle classes. It's a very sort of starkly divided municipality. This image didn't blow up so well, but there's Mount Avila in the background, and then this is a middle class urbanizaciones, and then this is the barrios of Petare on the right side of the photograph there. And you can just starkly see the divide within Caracas. And Sucre is right there. I mean, this is all municipio of Sucre. So if you're thinking about a place where urban participation is going to succeed, Sucre doesn't quite fit the mold. And especially that in the 2009, that's when I started doing research down in Sucre. It was governed by the sort of center-right political party. It was governed at a time when you had a ruling party of the left in national power. The local party in Sucre was very strongly anti-Chavista. And yet they ended up implementing participation, and they did so in a quite interesting and fairly effective way. So this is the mayor, Carlos Ocariz, who's from this center-right party, Primera Justicia. And this is at one of the many sort of popular meetings that you would go to in Petare and other barrios within Sucre. This is another sort of meeting he was at during my research there, which was 2011, 2012, was most of the time when I was down there. And this is one of the participatory budget assemblies. So I went in expecting that I would find some sort of manipulation of the participatory rhetoric that the national government was doing, a strong contrast to Torres. But instead, and then these are some Chavistas who were at some of the meetings, who in the first couple of years that Carlos Ocariz was in office would throw tomatoes at him, boycotted meetings, try to break them up. But things changed a bit. So to summarize the findings, I found that Sucre was unexpectedly successful in terms of participation. There was a moderate but pretty impressive extent of popular control. 40% of a budget went to participatory budgeting, and that amounted to about $35 million, which is a much bigger budget than you found in Torres. Thousands of citizens and dozens of officials would go to around 1,000 meetings a year. And weekend after weekend after weekend, they would get into their trucks and their cars and drive up in the hills of Petare, unload everybody, spend hours and hours. The next week, they would have technical assistance assemblies over Monday through Thursday night. So massive staff hours were going to this participatory budget process. It was moderately high quality popular control. So citizens had near binding control over decisions. So I found that they were not willing to actually give them sort of completely binding control, but most of the time they would actually sort of go with what citizens did. There was some notable, interesting contrast with Torres. So there was officials within Sucre who would ask, I'd say, why can't you give 100%? They do that in some place that I just came from Torres, and they say that would tie the mayor's hands. Some of them would say the people aren't ready, there's a lack of maturity, and some of them would say, well, we're going to move to 50%. So there was support for participation, but less so than you saw in the case of Torres, more than I was expecting. And we'll see, it's an interesting contrast with another city that I studied in Bolivia. Turnout was significant and rising. It was a couple thousand people who were showing up to this. Part of this was because it was a politically and socially inclusive process. Rising Chavista participation and extensive participation by popular classes and women. So if you go back here, these are Chavista participants who are in a participatory budget meeting with Carlos Ocariz, who in one of his participatory budget meetings sounded like a Chavista. He's talking about the fact that he said in the meeting that our opponents talked about doing Poder Popular, we're actually doing it. And we've been doing it and we don't exclude anyone and we're sort of doing all these things. It was institutionally effective. The projects were implemented in a timely and effective manner. Citizens implemented around 70% of the projects. And Chavistas who were politically opposed to the mayor actually offered a lot of praise for them. So the first couple of years, they were throwing tomatoes, they were boycotting, they were breaking up participatory budget assemblies. In the last couple of years, including most of the time that I was, well, I spanned a sort of year by going to other places, coming back. There was a big flip where Chavistas started participating more and more and more. And so this meant that there was sort of politically effective for the mayor. He was re-elected one time, and then the party vote improved, in particular in Chavista zones. And local state civil society relations became more cooperative over time. So this is a sort of chart that shows some of the changes that happened in the vote in a few different districts. So there's 5 parishes within Municipio Sucre, Caucahuita, Files de Mariche, La Dobarita, and Leonisio, and these 3 are the poorest ones. So these 3 are ones where Chavismo is strong. I mean, we're talking like 60 to 80% of the vote. In 2008, you can see that, you know, in Caucahuita, he barely gets 35%, and the other one's getting in the 20s. In 2010, he's going much, this isn't the mayor, but this was his party, Primera Justicia, getting up to 44%. So he's increasing by, 10 to 15 points in some of these districts. Dionisio Martinez is the elite part of Sucre. That's where the wealthy, whiter sector of the population lives, overwhelmingly pro-opposition, and that stays the same throughout. And then Petare is mixed, where it has middle class and poorer districts as well. And so it's also similar in that it's increasing support. So this demonstrates that you have massive and increasing support. So a key question was, how do I explain this case? And when I was doing my fieldwork, I was staying in Antimano, which is on the other side of Caracas, and I was staying with a bunch of leftists from Britain and other places, and I was telling them about this, and they're like, that's just BS, you're lying, you know, none of this could be happening, this is impossible. There's no way that it's right-wing, government. They thought they were the far-right fascists, all this sort of stuff. And so I'm sort of scratching my head trying to make sense of this, and this is what led to basically the core argument of the book, that there was a form of leftist hegemony within Venezuela that helps us explain the case of Sucre. And so I'm arguing that the Chavismo became hegemonic to an extent that they transformed politics so that even opposition parties had to play on Chavista terrain. And you can see this with Primera Justicia in the case of Municipio Sucre really, really clearly, because Carlos Ocariz sounded like a Chavista. Some of his advisors said, well, hold on, we don't like this. They didn't want him to do so much participatory budgeting. I asked many of them, why is he doing this? And they said, it's because of the contact, man, of course. He has to do it. Some of his advisors had more sophisticated analysis, and they said, the government has this national program. We have to have credibility with the local base here, and so we have to sort of do this. There were people in his administration, the Carlos Ocariz administration, who did believe significantly in participation, were sort of disaffected Chavistas. But it was this strong national context that was sort of pushing him to do that. One of the interesting pieces of evidence that convinces me of the argument was that Ocariz stopped doing this around 2014. So after Chavez dies in 2013, Venezuela's economy starts to go into a tailspin. Chavismo disappears, or the hegemony of Chavismo, the left populist hegemony, disappears at the national level, enters into a crisis that is still going on to this day. And Carlos Ocariz stops doing the participation that he's been doing before. This is overdetermined. There's a sort of series of sort of factors that help explain it. Inflation was starting to really, really kick in, so any kind of budgeting was difficult to do. But they basically stopped doing the participatory assembly. They started doing much smaller projects, and it coincides exactly with the period in which Chavismo became non-hegemonic at the national level, whereas in Torres, they actually continue it. It comes under strain, and there's sort of challenges, but they were a sort of more robust form. So again, just like Torres, this is pointing to national context as important for understanding local participation. And that's further exemplified when we turn our attention to Bolivia, which is the other country that I studied. And I started I went back and forth between Santa Cruz de la Sierra, which is the capital of the Santa Cruz in the eastern lowlands, and then El Alto, which are 2 very different cases. So Santa Cruz is the sort of economic powerhouse of Bolivia. a center of agricultural and sort of agro-industrial activity. It's a wealthy city by Bolivian standards, but it has lots and lots of poverty as well. You can see on the sort of overhead view of it, it's a city of anillos or rings. The farther away you get from the center, the more poverty you get, the more sort of darker skinned migrant highland populations you get from other parts out and indigenous populations within Bolivia, and the more strong support you get for the mosque. So Santa Cruz had a similar expectation to Sucre, that this is a city that was governed by a right-wing party between 2005 and 2020, basically. It was a place that had a pretty weak popular base of mobilization, popular organization. So this is a place I expected to find a failure of participation, and I did find it. Indeed, Santa Cruz was a marked failure, and so I can show you here. There was basically no popular control. Officials showed a disdain for participation to a really significant extent, and just share a couple quotes that are in the book that just make the case effectively for this. So I talked to lots of officials about participation. I got down there and I had heard something called neighbor demand. And so I was, spent a month or so trying to find out what's going on with neighbor demand. And I finally found this guy named Richard, who was in the Department of Parks and Gardens, which strangely enough was where neighbor demand was supposedly happening. This was a participatory sort of planning program that they did in accord with the 1994 law of popular participation. And so I finally found this guy after a month. And yes, finally, I'm going to find out about it. And he said, neighbor demand was a disaster. Participation works best when it's imposed by the executive. We, meaning officials, try to learn from experiences in other countries. Take traffic. The traffic solution doesn't come from a resident. He's just in his car and knows he doesn't want traffic, but he doesn't know how to make that happen. And then I talked to another official, many officials. They all said similar things. One, Carlos Gonzalez, who was the head of monitoring and control in the Department of Public Works, and he criticized what he called the extreme of too much participation of neighbor demand in 2006, which people told me was basically the last time it had happened. And I'm talking about in 2010 at this point. So he said, we analyze the city as a whole. It doesn't work to leave all the planning in the hands of the residents because they don't look at how the city is growing. And he felt that experts know what citizens need better than they themselves do. And he told me that in the last neighbor demand session he'd been at about 4 years prior to this, he said, quote, residents' priorities were health, education, paving, and drainage in that order. And then he proudly told me that the spending they did was exactly the reverse of this. They spent the most on paving and drainage and the least on health and education. And he said this showed, quote, that there's a difference between what residents say they want and what they actually need. There's a difference between what they say they want and what they do. So this was one of many quotes I got from officials in Santa Cruz. They hated the idea of participation, and they were sort of passionate about doing anything they could to sort of get away from it. There was some pseudo participation that happened within Santa Cruz. Officials would hold some participatory gatherings. There was some deliberation that happened, so I thought maybe there's a little bit of participation, but it turned out that officials would just impose their own priorities on residents. And so I was in one meeting where after a long time they came up with 2 soccer fields that they were going to fund, and the administrator or the facilitator of the meeting, who was romantically involved with the head of the committee that was supposed to monitor her. So there's lots of nepotism and things like that going on. Decided that she wanted a 3rd soccer field. She said, no, we're not going to do the 2. Let's keep talking. So they kept talking until they decided that they would fund a 3rd soccer field, and then she was finally happy. There was significant ethno-racial and political discrimination. And this was fused in the idea of the masista. So a masista, in the sort of view of the Cruceño sort of political right-wing alliance, with anyone who was dark-skinned from the highlands, whether or not they actually supported the Mas party. And they were sort of proud about it. They said, we don't actually stop them from coming. We just don't listen to them when they come, and then they stop showing up. So great, isn't it? Because I'm a white guy, they were very happy to share the racism with me lots and lots of times. How the Follas are, always protest and do all these things. And, I had lots of effective quotes. This is one area where I was just like, okay, tell me more. there was an appearance of institutional effectiveness where the mayor says, I'm a guy who gets things done, I'm the mayor who does this. And if you look at some of the official data, it looks like that. This is a chart showing budgetary execution rate. So what percentage of the budget is actually spent. And in Santa Cruz, it was consistently higher. This is the Bolivian large city average, and then Santa Cruz is the top line. It got up, I don't believe it ever got to 100%, but it was officially much higher than anything else. But then when I actually scratched the surface, I would find that residents said they were not actually getting anything that they needed. And so a former official who resigned under Percy Fernandez was the mayor at the time said that they budgeted lots of money for hospitals, but they didn't budget any money for doctors. And they budgeted money for schools, but no money for teachers. And this happened over and over and over again. So they had these cookie cutter projects that they did throughout the municipality, beautiful parks, beautiful school modules, but they're totally empty because they didn't actually do anything about it. There was also significant widespread corruption and fraud, and this was funny. In one of the supposed participatory meetings I went to, the official who was running the meeting was showing all these photographs of all these projects, and he said, "Look at this beautiful project that's been done." And then mostly women who were there in the attendance said, "Wait a second, that's my neighborhood. That project doesn't exist." And then another woman said that about another project, and then finally he said, "Oh yeah, well, kind of far away. I guess you're right. Maybe it doesn't exist." And so people told me they estimated that there was something between 60–80% phantom projects that were actually done, but they weren't actually done. They showed me receipts that they were part of a lawsuit where they had added extra ones to get additional money when they were supposed to have filling up gas for a municipal vehicle. They just had a one here and there. They had barbecues where they would sort of have votes for particular local citizen committees and things like that, but they wouldn't invite half of the population, any of the marxistas. So there was just rampant exclusion, rampant racism, rampant sort of prevention. And it was politically semi-effective. The mayor, Percy Fernandez, was reelected a couple of times, but he had a declining margin of victory. And I found there was widespread protest for inclusion by the marginalized. And so I spent a lot of my time looking at these different protests. One of them was in a place called Plan 3000, which is on the outskirts in past the fourth anillo, the fourth ring, an area where there was displaced residents from a flooding in 1983, but lots of highland migrants went there. It was a sort of bastion of the Mas. And this was many parts of the outer rings of Santa Cruz where there was massive protests by residents who were protesting against the imposition of officials who were excluding them from any projects, excluding them from any processes. But these protests didn't succeed a whole lot. And one of the reasons they didn't succeed was because the Mas political party sort of switched its strategy around 2010 from offering modest but not very effective, but still some support for the protest to actually aligning itself with the mayor. And you can see that here, Evo Morales, this is the right-wing governor of Santa Cruz, and this is the sort of center-right mayor, Percy Fernandez. Evo Morales meeting with them, lunching with them in 2013, laughing away. Percy Fernandez, the mayor of Santa Cruz in 2008, was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "We need a military coup to overthrow Evo Morales." And the governor of Santa Cruz also was notoriously sort of opposed to him. So this started getting me thinking, all right, well, Santa Cruz, like Torres, seems like a straightforward case. It's a right-wing sort of governed city. It has relatively weak popular organization and mobilization. That explains why they don't have successful participation. But there's some notable similarities that it has to the municipio of Sucre. Both of them had mayors. Percy Fernandez in the 1990s had actually been somewhat supportive of participation, which is also true for the mayor of Sucre there. They both have large sectors of urban poor population who were supportive of the National Ruling Left Party. And they both have sort of, something of a reformist bent at a certain point in their past history. And yet Percy Fernandez was doing things very, very differently. And so the argument I make here, again, is looking at the national context and looking at the project of Evo Morales and the ways in which he, started off, fairly close to social movements, but over time became increasingly aligned with the right, increasingly aligned with the lowland elite. and increasingly demobilizing the same movements that he came from. The most famous sort of infamous instance of this is the Kidneys conflict in 2011, where the Morales government was actually repressing popular movements that were arguing against a road being built through a national park, and everyone else was very much in favor of it, as was his key base, the Copaleros, but many indigenous groups were against it. So Evo Morales at the national level went through a trajectory that I characterized as passive revolutionary, and really sort of using a scholar, Massimo Molonesi, who talks about passive revolution as sort of the demobilization of previously activated popular movements, and you can really see that process happening in Bolivia under Evo Morales. So again, if you look at the national context, it helps us make sense of some of the things that are happening here, and that's easily seen in my final case, which is El Alto. And I'll wrap this up and then tell you some of the conclusions, and we'll be done in 5 or 6 minutes. So El Alto, Bolivia is the place where I was sure I was going to find participation. 81% indigenous population, 93% of the population from popular classes, very well organized, the center of the 2003 and 2005 gas wars. And these were sort of moments of revolution, practically in a Trotskyist sense. So I'll just read a quote that helps sort of exemplify that a little bit. So Trotsky talks about the most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of masses in historic events. He says, in ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation. History is made by specialists, kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. But at those crucial moments when the old order becomes no longer endurable by the masses, they break over the barriers, excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime. And so I talked to, or was at some events in 2008, the 5th anniversary of the 2003 gas war, and one of the participants in it said the neighbors were the police, the mayors, they were the power, and they decided who could go where. This was the people governing themselves, surpassing the vision of the leaders. And El Alto, a true revolution was taking place, in which the workers who toiled daily didn't feel capable of governing, but they were doing it. They organized themselves, and they didn't need doctors or lawyers to govern. So 2003 and 2005 were seen as these sort of moments of revolutionary upsurge within El Alto, where you saw, sort of direct governance, military organization at the local level to prevent government sort of repression and massacres. 75-ish people were killed. And then when I was doing my research, it was governed by the Movement Left Mas Party from 2010 to 2015, which had up here had posters like this that were throughout the city. This is right across from City Hall. So gobernar obedeciendo al pueblo, so ruling by obeying, basically sort of going back to Zapatista's slogan and other slogans that indigenous groups in Bolivia had. And there was symbols of El Alto's rebel nature. This is a statue of Che Guevara in La Ceja, which is a sort of busy central district. Right here, you can see just how crazy and busy it is. And this is one of many sort of civic parades that was happening in March. They have an anniversary of El Alto, and from like 8 a.m. until 6 p.m., you just see group after group after group after group marching through the city. So it's an incredibly well-organized city. The civic sort of infrastructure of the city, the organizational levels are through the roof. So I thought, I'm going to find participation. You have a dense civil society, a highly mobilized civil society with recent experience overthrowing presidents, a leftist party, a movement left party in office, but I didn't find that. I found very limited popular control over the budget. There was something like a participatory budget, and it had extensive popular input. There was a lot of assemblies that happened. Those assemblies were very well attended. But there was a lack of real popular control over decisions, and the reason for that, I'll get to in a couple minutes, is the institutional effectiveness. There was just incredible leakage out of the system. There was significant popular control over non-budgetary decisions, and there was a sort of significant popular control, social control over the local state, which led me to coin this as a case of inverted clientelism, where you basically have, instead of a traditional clientelism where you have sort of the state and political leaders exercising control over civil society, this is civil society exercising control over the state but in a way that benefits civic and political leaders instead of ordinary citizens. So I won't get into that concept here because it's a clunky one, but it helps make sense of the weirdness of El Alto, where you see a lot of participation, sort of, a lot of civic organizations, sort of, but it's still really corrupt, still very clientelistic. There's low quality popular control over decision making. There's deliberative decision making. So meetings aren't in fact deliberative. People are giving reasons, they're arguing, they're talking about things. It's fairly politically and socially inclusive, although with an important exception where women were participating significantly less, especially at the leadership level. And one of the main social organizations, the Federation of Neighborhood Association, had a woman president who was elected right after I got there in the beginning of my research, and she was removed after about 4 months for a combination of political and just plain misogynistic reasons. But the crucial sort of crux of the failure in El Alto was institutional ineffectiveness. There was sort of widespread, actually, I should have, but indicators indicate ineffectiveness. So I can show you this. I didn't update this slide, but El Alto was really sort of, nobody thought El Alto was effective. This is compared to the large Bolivian cities, with one exception. It was profoundly below, and it really fell through the ground in 2010, 2011. Álvaro García Linera, who's the vice president of Bolivia, repeatedly pointed to El Alto as poorly implementing projects and not doing what it should be doing. And so this was a place that was really sort of not working. There was a massive policy reversal in 2010 to 2011, December 2010. Garcia Linero actually, when Evo was out of town, he announced an increase in the price of gas. It was known as the gasolinazo right after, because there was massive popular uprisings. And what happened in El Alto was interesting. The MAS controlled the local government, but the MAS's offices were smashed up. Local civic associations, this is the core, the Central Obrero Regional, so the regional worker centers, so the main sort of confederation of trade unions in the city of El Alto. Tejuve, the main sort of biggest civic association of neighborhood associations, had similar sort of smashed up blasts. That was happening as well. And so you can see, if you're looking at sort of the political and the institutional effectiveness that's going on here, El Alto is really ineffective on both of these fronts. And sorry, I did not update these last couple of slides. A little scattered. I was wondering if this event was canceled earlier today, so my mind was in a few places as I was finishing it. But essentially, this is what happened to the mayor of El Alto. He got arrested, and he spent a couple of years in jail after he was mayor. And so El Alto shows that the national context again is really sort of crucial for understanding local participation. So why did El Alto? The big picture here would be, why did El Alto not have participatory success? It looks very promising on paper, and yet it was a complete and utter failure in the research that I did there. And so a key reason is that they were following, in some crucial ways, the national model. They were also sort of following the counter-revolutionary, demobilizing route. And what was particularly striking was how similar officials in El Alto sounded to officials in Santa Cruz. So remember, in Santa Cruz, they were so against participation. So I, being a naive grad student, and I'm doing this, I come in and I'm like, hey, I have a presentation about participatory budgeting and quotas. You guys want to see it? And they're like, yeah, let's see it. So I give this presentation to the planning office in El Alto, and I'm like, isn't this great? Isn't this awesome? Aren't you going to do all these things? And they're like, so you said it was politically stable. They brought order. That's what we need. We need order. So they were obsessed with order. They were obsessed with all these things. They talked about a thesis of the dictatorship of social organizations and the need to control social organizations, limit participation, get our house in order. Those are all quotes that officials told me repeatedly. And when you get inside, you can sort of see the logic of that. They felt overwhelmed. They felt as though social organizations were controlling them. There was a logic of social organizations who would be sort of, they would put their own person in place of different local sort of, not ministries, but the local sort of the local departments within the municipal government. And they would be loyal to the association, to the organization, rather than to the mayor. So there's this bureaucratic incoherence, there's an inability to actually have a functioning municipality because of this weird strength of social mobilization, but the fact that it wasn't being channeled in a participatory way. And then the national context was a demobilizing one, and that sort of reinforced it. So stepping back from the details and now looking at so this is just sort of showing you everyone else's transition from a sort of more radical left leader to a passive revolutionary leader, allying himself with the right wing. So leftist hegemony, I argue that Hugo Chavez is a Margaret Thatcher of the left. And so this is sort of getting to the takeaways of the book. Got to be a little provocative. So Margaret Thatcher was asked in 2000, sometime around 2000, she was asked, "What's your greatest accomplishment?" Does anyone know what she said? Only Blair. And she said, "We forced our opponents to change their minds." And so I argue that Thatcher could be considered a Gramscian theorist of hegemony. Stuart Hall has a similar argument. That she basically understands hegemony really well. That's what hegemony is, forcing your opponents to change their mind. So Hugo Chavez effectively did that with Capriles, who's the leader of Prima Justicia. So he runs for office against Chavez in 2012 and then against Maduro in 2013. Greg Brandon has a nice column in The Nation where he says he's a Chavista. He's arguing for all of these social programs. He's arguing for more social spending, more effective social spending. I'm not going to end the missions. His, buddy, Carlos Ocariz, who's the mayor of Sucre, who I was studying, is doing all this participatory budgeting. He's talking about it as poder popular. He's getting more and more Chavistas to show up. And so Chavez is really sort of successful in achieving this form of leftist hegemony. So this is Ocariz saying, we don't just believe in popular power, we're doing popular power. And so the big sort of takeaways of the book, one of the sort of big ones is that we've heard a lot about neoliberal hegemony, we've heard a lot about right-wing hegemony, but leftists can achieve hegemony, and when they do, it can have similar effects in that it can transform the right just the way that right-wing or neoliberal hegemony can transform the left. Of course, and I'm not going to get into this a whole lot, leftist hegemony didn't stick around in Venezuela. It had a very precarious political foundation on Chavez's chavismo. It had a very precarious material foundation on oil, which Julie has written about effectively, and Fernando Coronel as well, of course. And so Chavismo was built on Venezuela's political economy, and that's not a sustainable sort of material base. So once the material foundations of Chavismo hegemony crumbled, it didn't stick around. So there's important, interesting questions to get into, but it nonetheless was there, and nonetheless had these very interesting effects while it was there. And you can strikingly see sort of forcing your opponents to change their mind happen in Venezuela, but not in Bolivia. In Bolivia, the right continued to be the right. And so another broader argument in the book is sort of briefly looking at the history of the right in Latin America and Europe, and you see the right overwhelmingly across history has two basic moves towards democracy: either no democracy or safe democracy. So the right, from the French Revolution through most of the 19th century, no, we don't want any democracy whatsoever. Then they figure out, okay, well, we can tame it, we can keep it safe, we can keep it within certain bounds. So we'll have safe democracy as long as it doesn't touch material interests, as long as you have strong political parties of the elite, so conservative political parties, moderate left parties that don't sort of do things. Chavismo breaks a lot of these rules. You have a radicalizing leftist political party that's mobilizing popular classes to a significant extent, and doing it in a way that actually brings the right along with it. So that leads me to sort of the final takeaways that real democracy, instead of fake democracy, thinking about making democracy real, is more possible than many think under certain circumstances, specifically under a circumstance of leftist hegemony. The right can be forced to change its mind. And another takeaway is that we should place local participation in its national context. So if we want to sort of look at the four cases, if you're looking at them just through the lens of local factors, the two left cases look kind of similar, but they have very different outcomes, and the two right cases look kind of similar, but they have very different outcomes. It's hard to explain those outcomes without recourse to the national context, so it shows you the importance of doing that. And then also, I didn't talk a whole lot about this, but I think the book pushes folks to rethink Venezuela and Bolivia as cases of the left turn. So when I went into it, I thought the way a lot of people think, that Evo Morales is going to be more participatory, he's going to be more friendly to social movements. He comes from the movement left party. Chavez comes from a sort of military background and eventually turns into sort of a left populist, which doesn't seem like it'll be particularly positive for actual participation. And yet I found the opposite, so maybe we should rethink left populist and movement left party a little bit. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, no, didn't look at the time.
Here. That was wonderful. Let me open this up to the audience for questions if there are any. I have one for sure. Anyone? So let me sort of take I guess moderator's privilege here. This Ocariz, is it?
Yeah.
What options did he have to not participate in participatory budgeting? Like, because you're making the argument that the left or Chavez changes sort of the playing field, but could he have opted out of participating in participatory budget?
He could have been Maria Corina Machado.
Okay.
So she is the leader of the opposition now. If she's allowed to run, she will be the next president of Venezuela without a doubt. She is a hardcore anti-Chavista. So she was not swayed by Chavista hegemony, and there were members of the right that weren't. But Maria Corina Machado was not the leader of the opposition in 2008 because I would argue there was Chavista hegemony. Right. There was this left populist hegemony. So Ocariz could have continued doing that. And there was a 2002 coup and people like Pedro Carmona, do a coup against Chavez. They have a right-wing, basically a 48-hour right-wing, highly right-wing dictatorship where they abrogate the Constitution, get rid of elections, get rid of all the laws, start implementing these massively sort of free market policies. That gets overturned. So some sectors of the right stick with that program. It's sort of a rejectionist program, a sort of intransigent rejection of Chavismo. They try that for a number of years. They try that in the oil strike in 2002, 2003. They tried in the 2004 recall referendum against Chavez. They tried it in a boycott of the election in 2005. None of that works. So the strategy of rejecting Chavez doesn't work. And by 2006, you see the right starting to switch. So Ocariz could have done something else, but I would argue he wouldn't have been politically effective or particularly politically effective. I think politicians who took that more rejectionist stance could be effective in pockets, but they couldn't win places like Sucre, which had a large popular base that had been Chavista for a while.
I guess I'm just curious about what would have happened to the money, right? Like I'm thinking about if Ocariz had said, this is a sham, I'm not doing this, would the central government have said, you will not have money to spend, right? Is to sort of let, this idea that you can only spend the money if you play by these rules.
Yeah, they
did not say that, the central government?
No, they never liked Ocariz. So they never thought they didn't think he was like the Chavista. They just thought he was a fascist and a far right. Okay. So their own discourse of it, never really changed. So I would say that, this is one difference I didn't get into, but 86% of the budget in Sucre comes from taxes, local taxes. And so they were able to evade some of that. So they did get messed around with at the sort of national level. I will say that, his election, he was elected in 2008 and the election stood. Nobody came in and, sort of got him out. He was reelected in 2013. Again, the election stood. So there's lots of sort of debate and discourse about Venezuela being competitive authoritarian and things like this, but on the brute basic fact of, winning an election and the opposition being allowed to take power, they were. Right. And they continued to get opposition. So I'd say in terms of your main question, they didn't like him. Right. They never liked him. And they probably preferred people like Maria Corina Machado because they could say the difference was so stark, right? Exactly. Right. Sure. Ocariz was winning votes of Chavistas. He had Chavistas who were voting for him, or at least, less opposed to him. And that was probably more of a threat. And actually, I didn't talk about this, but there was, fascinating stuff. This sort of addresses the messiness of what you're talking about. The National Fundo Comunal, which is one of the national organizations that was tasked with basically registering communal councils and letting people participate in, civic associations and things like that. I talked to, directors in that who were in Municipio Sucre, and they said, we use the Lista de Tascón. This is a list of people who signed the recall referendum in 2004, and it was notoriously sort of discriminatory. They say, we look at that and we see if any leaders are on that, we're not going to give them a dime. So there was discrimination that was happening. There was some of the things that critics talk about. What happened at the grassroots level was sort of fascinating, that people in Sucre would sometimes have a list of Chavista. Sometimes like there'd be mixed communal councils, and they would put forward a list of Chavista leaders, but then in the background, they would actually have a mixed group of some Chavistas, some oppositionists to evade that. So they knew what was happening, but they sort of worked around it. Sometimes they had Chavista leaders who were corrupt and they'd vote them out. So there was these sort of grassroots efforts to evade the censors in a sense.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, they tried to sort of tie his hands, but it was contradictory. These are the contradictions of Chavismo as well. That,
Right.
you know, Chavez also encouraged people to participate with Carlos Ocaris because he would say, this is your money, these are your funds, even though a lot of it was local taxes, but he would sort of do that and some of them would believe it. So, you know, there's all these sort of messiness and contradictions that were going on.
Where is he now? Just out of curiosity. Ocaris.
Ocaris, he is still, he's still down there.
Okay.
Yeah, he's still, I mean, he's still sticking around. He's still a member of Crimen Justicia.
Okay.
I think he had some familial health problems, so he was in and out of Miami for years, which got him in some political hot water.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Anyone? No comments? Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
Research is a kind of and it doesn't stop. You have to stop the research because of other things. But have you tried since you finished your field work and then track now then how is it going?
A little bit, not as much as I want. And I, you know, I started writing more critically about the Venezuelan government. I was summoned to a meeting by Ignacio Ramonet, actually in the East Village at one point to talk about, we don't like your writings on Venezuela. You know, so I don't actually, I'm not sure if I'd get a visa to go down there if I wanted to. No, I mean, there's other problems. It's like the US policies toward Venezuela are so atrocious in that, you know, there's not embassies, not ways to do it. So I haven't been able to actually get down there. There's other sort of personal reasons that it's been hard to travel, COVID, etc. But I've tracked it to the best of my ability. And so within Municipio Sucre, one of the mayors who I talk about fairly unfavorably in the book, he's a Chavista predecessor to Carlos Ocaris. He's the one who talked about doing popular power, but didn't do it, according to Ocaris, who is the son of Vicente Rangel, Jose Vicente Rangel Avalos, the son of Jose Vicente Rangel, who's a famous journalist and leftist sort of politician within Venezuela, highly respected. His son, not so much, but he's now the mayor of Sucre again. And this was partly not so much, I would say, not directly because of authoritarianism or sort of, I don't dispute that that's going on now and has been for a number of years, but I think that in the case of Sucre, the opposition has had this boycotting strategy again, which hasn't been particularly effective. So that's something else we could talk about. But in the latest municipal elections, I think the opposition just sort of said, we're not going to participate. This is an authoritarian government, and so the Chavistas were able to win again. Although in Torres, the opposition did participate and did win. And so they were sort of thrown out after being in power for a very long time. And so Torres is another, that's the case I started with, a very successful case. And that one stuck around, the participation that they had going there stuck around for quite a while. Through the last visit I had to Venezuela, which was 2016, they were still doing participatory budgeting. They were still trying to be inclusive. They were still managing it. There was a lot of contradictions in Venezuela at the time. They were clinging on, but it was losing its pluralistic character. It was becoming more exclusionary. There were fewer oppositionists. Some municipal officials were mad about that and trying to figure out how to do something else. So it wasn't like they themselves were excluding it. There was some self-exclusion, but there were more intransigent sort of rojitos within the sort of local government that were gaining more and more control, more power. So things were fraying. So the national crisis that was going on, the loss of sort of hegemony at the national level, was showing up even in places that have been sort of consolidated and really strong for Chavismo. So that, at the local level, and then at the national level, the brief story would be that, there under Maduro, there was a consolidation of an authoritarian regime in Venezuela that happened under US sanctions, that happened under, a effective blockade, which has had, horrendous effects on people's health in Venezuela. and it's also, I would say, it's led to more hardline policies by the government. But at the local level, that's sort of the best that I've been able to trace it. And then Bolivia has its own set of contradictions, which I'm happy to talk about. Some of you probably know that, the MOS is tearing itself apart right now. So that's another sad story.
I'm curious about how did you frame the question of participation in the transaction? Like how did you ask that question?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a language of participation in Bolivia which comes from the 1994 law of popular participation, and so there's this idea of local participation, and so I would just sort of use that. I mean, I tried to, as much as possible, use language that local people would sort of use, and I would say, how do people participate in, decisions, or I would find out. I mean, I spent a lot of time, what is the form that the law of popular participation takes, and they said it's neighbor demand. And so then I spent weeks and weeks trying to find what is neighbor demand. Can I go to a meeting? Where is it happening? And then I found, civic associations that were opposed to the mayor saying there is no neighbor demand. They stopped doing it. And then I found officials who said we stopped doing it. And so, the evidence in Santa Cruz was overwhelmingly clear that it wasn't happening. But that's sort of how I did it. And then I would go to meetings and I would just sort of observe what's happening. And so I did find out, by sticking around a bunch, and actually, my commitment to my research was strong. I was invited to a Shakira concert on the same day there was a meeting, and I went to the meeting. So I'm very sad of it. But,
I mean, just buy this book, folks.
Yeah, you got it.
Just
got it.
help the man out.
Yeah, then maybe I can go see Shakira
Right.
some other time. I would tell grad students go to the concert.
Go to the concert, yeah.
But so and this one meeting that I went to ended up being a valuable one, in that it was this sort of pseudo participation. And so I tried to go to anything that was happening. I tried to just sort of, show up wherever things were happening, and repeatedly show up over and over and over again, so I could see what was happening. There weren't as many opportunities in Santa Cruz because there wasn't that much even pseudo participation going on. But even when I went to the meetings, I would find out, what's going on. And then I did a lot of, it was basically like investigative journalism with a lot of Gramsci, sort of, but I got the Gramsci off to the side while I was doing the research. And so I, just show up and, people would tell me these things, and then I'd show up and I'd ask all the people that they told me, yeah, we invited all of them. And then I go and ask them, and they said, they didn't invite any of us, and here's the receipts that show that they didn't invite any of us. And here's the 50 times that we tried to meet with them. And here's all the different ways they responded to us in racist ways. So I just sort of, tried to follow every lead to the best of my ability until I felt like I was saturated with, okay, I have a good sense that, yeah, this is what actually happened. So that's over answering your question, but provides a little.
That's what it goes to my question. I've been part of participating in budget in New York City. So I'm wondering, like, if there was outreach in certain groups that you saw, and like if there was, how was the outreach? Like, I'm sure there was, like, if there was a class kind of system or racial in that regard.
Yeah, you mean like within Venezuela and Bolivia, like how they were organizing it. So Torres is, the case that I'll start with, and there it's impressive. And I've been sort of critical. I haven't been involved in participatory budgeting in the U.S. in a number of years, although I think I'm still on the board of advisors of the Participatory Budgeting Project. And when I was finishing my research, I did a bunch in Vallejo, which is the first city in the U.S. Or no, I guess not the first, but one of the first to do it. The process in the U.S., to my limited knowledge, has not involved very much money. It hasn't involved a lot of popular organization. It hasn't involved the sort of local state going in and trying to organize people. In Torre, there was significant efforts to do that. And so there was an Office of Participation. There's a fellow named Lalo Paez, who's a social movement leader, who was part of Julio Chavez's administration. He had 22 social promoters who were going out, and they were just trying to help people. I mean, it was sort of bureaucratic. They wanted them to fill out the paperwork so they could register as communal councils. They wanted to make sure, here's how you can participate in the participatory budget. But they were really doing a lot of organizing work, boring organizing work, to make sure that people would show up, make sure people would participate, make sure they would do so in ways that would allow them to actually do that. They really believed in it. They were very committed to that. In Sucre, this is one of the differences. They didn't have that. So Sucre was fascinating because what happened there was actually the more Chavistas participated, the better the participatory budget got. And the officials knew that. They themselves were critical of the highly limited, thin form of participation that they were trying to do, because they told me, all of these projects, when people just show up on a Saturday and they haven't met with anybody and they're just coming up with a project, I don't know if that's representative of the community. I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't know if anybody else supports it. When the Chavistas come, we know they've had an assembly. They probably had 2 assemblies. They're really organized. They're really sort of doing things. So, this is another bit, I think, about the Chavista hegemony, that, organizing was a big thing. The 1999 Constitution under Chavez was about participatory and protagonistic democracy. Chavez, for all his many faults, was constantly talking about participation, constantly talking about it. He was sort of didactically telling people in the Alo Presidente, here's what you do if you want to form a communal council. You fill out this paperwork and then you show up here and then you get the money. And, he just went over all the steps. And, people would turn the TV off when they got bored, but that made some difference. And it also meant people would grab onto that language. They felt as though there was a national project that made sense, that they were part of, that they could sort of do. And so you saw it at the local level, but you also saw it at the national level. Bolivia had something like that, even though I'd say they didn't have a form of leftist hegemony. There was a national project. There also was just a massive amount of local organizing. So people there knew how to organize, but they couldn't quite, have the same success. So, compared to the US, I think the key difference was that, you have this big national political project where participation is central, is really important. And then you have local officials who are very committed to organizing participation, making it work, making it happen. And it was about money that matters. So, Gianpaolo Beocci and I are colleagues and friends, and we've talked about this, and he's written about it too, that when participation is about things that matter, people show up and they do so passionately. When it's about the crumbs, people don't as much. And that's overly disparaging. Sometimes the crumbs are important and, people can get things. But in New York City, I live on the Gowanus Park Slope border. And, I go to Prospect Park, of course, and there's benches and there's tunnels that are from participatory budgeting. In Torres, it was the roads, it was the drainage, it was the community centers, it was things that really mattered to the city and to the residents there. And so in the US, it just hasn't sort of done that. And I think it's partly because they haven't put in the effort to organize it and really make sure people show up.
Also, I think in New York, what's interesting is that participation happens. I don't want to say after the fact, but if you think about the community board system, right, where developers, for example, have to go to the community board in order to get approval for particular projects. There's where you see sort of the community can frenar particular projects if it wants to, but it did. I think you're right. The big projects in the city aren't necessarily drafted in this kind of system, right? It's after the fact that people can have a say or jump into the process.
Yeah, and I don't know, the budget of New York City must be, hundreds of billions
Yeah,
of dollars.
right.
And participatory budgeting might cover like $45 million, tiny,
Sure, yeah.
drop in the bucket. And so it indeed is sort of after, and it's also just completely absent, or it's in this more frenar way. It's, it's
Right.
been a different process. It's not part of the whole structure of it. I mean,
Right.
Torres, it was amazing in that sense that like it just everything
seems
that
that
was
way.
done there was like imbued with this participatory logic, and people really, if you wanted something to happen, you had to show up at the meeting, you had to be there, you had to organize.
What was the response of the business sector to this?
That's a great question. I mean, on a political
I don't
level,
think I
there's
saw them on the list of the participants were they there?
so in Torres, there was, there's the class structure in Torres, initially there's a sort of idea of the Godaria, which goes back to the sort of groups in Spain that came over in, I think, like the 16th, 17th century to Torres. And we're basically formed this sort of landowning class. And this is a term that continues to be used to this day, where the elites are sort of referred to as the Godos or La Godaria. And their actual class position has transformed. There's still some very wealthy cattle ranchers and cattle owners, and then there's some very poor sort of aristocrats, if you will, who live in the center of the city. But some of them have participated in the participatory budget. And they sort of participated to get, lights for the center of the city, the colonial casco in the center of Carora, which is the main city in Torres. And so there was some participation from members of the families, the leading families, the sort of named families within Torres. The business class, by and large, was a major a proud sort of antagonistic foe of Julio Chavez in particular.
Right.
You know, he talked about the oligarchy all the time. He really went after them in terms of sort of trying to promote land reform. So they were very implacably opposed at an
Right.
organizational level. I mean, there's a sort of cattle ranchers association and other sort of agricultural associations. Those are the main sort of upper class sort of associations. I think under his predecessor, those relations became a little better. You know, if you're going to run a city for decades, you're going to want to, you know, establish somewhat better relations with folks. So there was some of that, but politically, you know, the sort of dominant class within Torres remained within the opposition throughout. And that was a source of pride from the sort of left mayors of the city as well.
Okay.
But you know, it's a good question. That's one where I wish, you know, I did a lot of field work for the book, but there's always areas where I wish I could have done more. Like,
Right,
there's
sure.
you know, I'm like there on my like fifth, you know, thing, and I'm like, oh, I gotta get a meeting with somebody from there, and then I gotta leave. So,
Right.
you know, couldn't quite get it. So that's one area that I wish I had deepened a little bit more, because it's probably more complicated than I even fully understand.
Best project is a done project. So,
Yeah, that's true.
anyway, any other questions? Yes, Julie.
Wondering, in looking at this process, for instance, in Portland, especially because the Chavistas were organized and trained and organizing, was part of that training and organizing also their maintaining the limits as to what kinds of things could ever be considered on the agenda? And as you know, there's a criticism of Chavismo from within, not from like, for instance, about never being able to really discuss the oil dependent model, not being able to discuss alternative forms of enrichment. So at the local level, even maybe sources of pollution, maybe you know, what to do with waste, or perhaps more sustainable forms of agriculture. But this is a you know, cattle raising region, or was it very much said, okay, whatever we consider to be participatory has to be on already agreed upon limits of, let's say, the local infrastructure as it's already defined. It's there, let's repair it. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, this gets to the fascinating origins of Torres and the fact that they came from outside of official Chavismo, and that made a difference for like a decade afterwards. So they were pushing against the limits from inside the local state because they had been opposed to the national bureaucracy and to the national and regional political parties. So Julio Chavez came from a you know, he wasn't part of the Fifth Republic. He was part of Patria para Todos, which was a left party that at times was allied with the Fifth Republic movement, but at times was not, and was not in 2004 when he was running against it. And so he put in place a bunch of officials who were also sort of outside of the official Chavista circuits, some of whom, you know, didn't actually join the PSUV, the national ruling party, until like 2015 or something. I mean, they were really sort of out of it. Julio Chavez's chief of staff was this Argentine anarchist named Johnny Murphy, who then ended up opening a bar outside the city. You know, big bear of a man.
You gotta write a book about him.
Yeah. He's in there a little bit, but
Okay.
yeah. He just emailed me today. I'm supposed to talk to him on WhatsApp sometime soon, but we haven't talked in years actually, but it'll be interesting to catch up. So, you know, they had this they had this sort of you know, rebel origin outside of the national bureaucracy, and they were constantly pushing up against the limits of that, and they were organizing their base. So the participatory budget, they actually, the city council, which was run by the Fifth Republic movement in 2005, Julio Chavez's first year in office, refused to support the participatory budget that he had just done, and he mobilized hundreds of people to occupy City Hall. He's the mayor, but he has people, so it's like an insider-outsider strategy where he brings people to occupy it. He then tries to run as the governor, sort of the candidate in the primaries of the PSUV for governor of the state of Laura in 2008, and they refused to even let him on the ballot. So he mobilizes hundreds of people. They finally let him on the ballot. He gets trounced. He doesn't do well at all, but he was allowed to run. So that dynamic of sort of coming from outside, eventually in 2007, Julio Chavez joins the PSUV. And he supposedly does so at the behest of Hugo Chavez, the president. And Julio Chavez is actually put on a presidential task force for popular participation. So again, the contradictions of the national state are in evidence. But Fundatungo now, just like they're sort of messing with things in Sucre, they're also messing with things in Torres. There's all these communes that have been established in Torres and they refuse to register them for years and years. But this, I mean, it creates problems, but what it does is it maintains a logic of mobilization and base building, which I think sustains the energy, sustains the participation in Torres for years and years. So they're rebels in a sense. And they never lose that. Even in 2016, they're still sort of, trying to fight against the bureaucracy, trying to fight against things. They're still supportive of the Chavista project at a political level electorally, but they're running up against it. So I think the controlling logic that you're talking about was there, but it was against the local state. And it's more complicated than that in the sense that there was, young organizers who go to Cuba and they're part of this Frente Francisco Miranda and they get, doctrinaire training in Fidelismo, and then they come back and they're sort of more Chavista than the Chavistas, and then they're, sort of inside and outside the local administration. So, there's different factions and different forces, but the interplay of things at the local level is complicated in a way that I think is productive for a number of years.
Any other questions? If not, join me in thanking our guest tonight. Thanks, Gabriel. It was really wonderful. A couple of copies of the book here for those of you who are interested. Just a quick word of thanks to our Claco staff, Fatima Vélez, Kathy Cabrera, for being here again and helping us pull this off. Flawless as always. So,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a real pleasure.
fantastic. We're working back with the next project with the Argentine bar owner.
Yeah.
I want to hear about him. All right, so